There's a sentence, a single truth, that when spoken by a fed-up empath, instantly shatters a narcissist's illusion of control. It's not loud, it doesn't beg, it doesn't need permission. But when it's finally said, it echoes in the narcissist's fragile psyche like thunder in a cathedral. Because for the first time, the empath isn't explaining, isn't fixing, isn't shrinking to keep the peace. They're simply done. You see, this isn't just a story of toxic relationships or emotional betrayal. This is about psychological warfare that unfolds in silence, in glances, in the slow erosion of boundaries. It's a dynamic that Carl Jung understood long before it was trending. He called it projection, the act of casting our denied parts onto others. And in the relationship between an empath and a narcissist, projection isn't a symptom, it's the whole game. The narcissist, full of unacknowledged wounds and shadows, finds the empath person made of intuition and light and uses them as a mirror. But mirrors can crack. And when they do, everything the narcissist avoided seeing comes rushing back in their direction. That moment, when the empath finally steps out of the role they never asked to play, is nothing short of psychological rebellion. Jung believed that individuation, becoming fully who you are, requires us to integrate the very parts we've been avoiding. The empath's journey is exactly that. And sometimes, individuation begins not with a new chapter, but with a final sentence, "That's not mine to carry anymore." This video is for the ones who've stayed too long, loved too hard, and given too much. It's for the empaths who are exhausted from carrying the emotions of everyone but themselves. Today we name the truth. We confront the shadow. And we give you the words that narcissists fear most, not because they're cruel, but because they're true. Stay until the end, because once you hear this clearly, you'll never be manipulated the same way again. Let's begin. Empaths are not weak. They are not fragile. They are not too sensitive. They are emotional seismographs feeling things others refuse to notice. They walk into rooms and absorb moods before a single word is spoken. They carry not just their own wounds, but the silent grief of strangers, the tension in a friend's voice, the fear behind a smile. But let's be clear. Feeling everything isn't fragility, it's power without armor. And that power has a price. True empaths don't wear capes, they wear exhaustion. Not because they're dramatic, but because they've been holding space for others their whole lives. Peacekeepers, fixers, emotional translators. They understand what you mean, even when you say the opposite. They know when you're lying to yourself, even if they never call it out. Their gift is empathy. Their curse is forgetting that they matter too. Carl Jung would say they are unconsciously carrying not just their own shadows, but the disowned parts of others. They pick up what has been denied, cast out, rejected. Why? Because they see what others avoid, and instead of turning away, they stay, they listen, they feel. But the danger is this: when you don't know where others end and you begin, your life becomes a blurred page in someone else's story. Empaths aren't made in comfort. They're forged in early lessons where love came with conditions and silence became safety. Many were raised to anticipate emotional storms and prevent them before they hit. And now, as adults, they are magnets for the broken, the charming manipulators, the ones who say, "I need you," but mean, "I'll drain you." But here's what most people get wrong. Empaths aren't weak for feeling so deeply. They're strong for surviving it. They don't need fixing, they need remembering. Remembering that just because they understand everyone's pain doesn't mean they should carry it. That their empathy is a gift, not a leash. And the moment they remember who they are truly, unapologetically, that's when the dynamic shifts. That's when the narcissist starts to tremble, because an empath who knows their worth is no longer prey, their power. To understand a narcissist, you must stop looking at what they show and start seeing what they hide. Because nothing about a narcissist is truly real, not their charm, not their confidence, not even their cruelty. It's all a mask, a carefully constructed persona built to survive in a world they secretly fear will discover just how empty they feel inside. Carl Jung warned us, The persona is the mask we wear for the world. But the danger isn't the mask, it's mistaking it for identity. The narcissist's mask is dazzling. It flatters, seduces, entertains. It tells you everything you've ever wanted to hear. And then, quietly, it starts rewriting who you are. They mirror your desires, your fears, your values until you start thinking you've met someone who truly gets you, but you haven't. What you've met is a shapeshifter, someone who becomes what you need until you forget to ask what they need, because the answer is control. Always control. But beneath that glittering surface lies the shadow-repressed insecurity, buried shame, unhealed wounds. Jung said that what we don't make conscious, we live out as fate, and the narcissist is fate in motion. A person who refuses to face their inner void, so they turn others into emotional supply lines, feeding off admiration, submission, and silence. Their charm isn't affection, it's strategy. Their grandiosity isn't confidence, it's camouflage. And here's the cruelest twist. The narcissist believes their own act. Their mask becomes so seamless, even they forget they're wearing it. That's why, when you finally confront them with truth gently, clearly, honestly, it doesn't lead to reflection. It leads to rage, because the mask can't survive the mirror. And when the empath finally becomes the mirror, everything starts to crack. They don't just see the truth, they reflect it. And for a narcissist, truth is the most terrifying exposure there is. The narcissist doesn't just stumble upon the empath, they seek them. Instinctively, as if drawn by radar to the one soul most likely to say yes, stay quiet, and give endlessly. Not because the empath is naive, but because they're understanding. Not because they're weak, but because they're willing to carry what isn't theirs without complaint. To the narcissist, that's irresistible. Because what they're looking for isn't love, it's fuel. Empaths absorb. They feel without filter, and they give without condition. They don't just hear what you say, they feel what you don't. And in the early stages, this makes them everything the narcissist ever wanted: attentive, forgiving, deeply available. But here's the hidden danger. The empath's greatest gift becomes their greatest vulnerability. Because while they're listening, the narcissist is studying, calculating, testing where the boundaries blur, where guilt can be planted, where the hooks can sink in. To the narcissist, the empath is the perfect mirror, not because they reflect admiration, but because they reflect humanity, depth, emotion, the very things the narcissist cannot access within themselves. And so they take, slowly at first, then all at once, validation, support, identity. They feed on the empath's peace because they have none of their own. They crave the empath's calm because their own inner world is chaos. But this is what they never expect. The empath may be slow to awaken, but once they do, they don't just see the pattern, they feel it in their bones. They start noticing how often they apologize for things that aren't their fault, how often they minimize their own needs to keep the peace, how often they're left exhausted after interactions that should feel safe. And when that awareness clicks into place, something shifts. The mirror sharpens. The empath begins to reflect not admiration, but truth. And narcissists can't stand the truth because it reveals their hollowness. This is why the empath becomes the battleground, because the one who once absorbed everything starts to reject the lies. They start to say no. They start to pull away. And nothing destabilizes a narcissist faster than an empath who finally sees through them and stops feeding the illusion. It always starts small. A subtle contradiction. A look that doesn't match the words. A promise broken but with a perfect excuse. The empath notices it, feels it, but brushes it off. Because love makes space. Because empathy gives the benefit of the doubt. But that doubt becomes the doorway. And once it's open, the cycle begins. First comes the gaslighting, the quiet distortion of reality. That never happened. You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. The empath, so used to self-reflection, turns inward. They question themselves, not the other, because they've been conditioned to carry blame even when it doesn't belong to them. So they adjust, they rationalize, they shrink. Then comes the breadcrumbing, tiny crumbs of attention, affection, validation, just enough to keep hope alive, never enough to truly feel safe. It's emotional starvation disguised as intimacy. The empath clings to the glimpses of connection, convinced that if they just love harder, try more, stay a little longer, the warmth will return. But it doesn't, because it was never real. It was a lure. By now, the trauma bond has formed. An emotional roller coaster of highs and lows, love and neglect, kindness and cruelty. It's not love, it's chemical. It's addictive. The same person who wounds you is the only one who can offer the illusion of relief. And the empath, with all their compassion, falls into the deepest trap of all, the fixer role. They become the emotional nurse, the healer, the rescuer. They think, if I just understand them enough, I can help them change. But what they don't see is that the narcissist doesn't want healing, they want control. And the more the empath gives, the more the narcissist takes, until there's nothing left but a shell of the person who once radiated light. This cycle is not an accident, it's a system. A silent contract where the empath gives their soul in exchange for a love that never truly existed. But every cycle has a breaking point. And the moment the empath begins to see the pattern not as love, but as manipulation, that's the beginning of the end. The extraction stops when the empath finally realizes, this is not mine to fix, and it never was. At first, the shift is internal. There's no announcement, no confrontation, no final dramatic scene. Just silence. A calm that replaces the storm. The empath stops explaining, stops justifying, stops trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding them. And in that sacred pause a clarity begins to bloom. The silence isn't passive, it's a boundary, a line drawn without a word. Where once the empath would rush to repair the atmosphere, now they sit still. Where once they would plead to be heard, now they simply observe. Because they've finally realized that truth doesn't need approval to exist, and peace doesn't require permission. This silence is powerful because it's the opposite of what the narcissist expects. They thrive on chaos, on reaction, on emotional entanglement. They poke and prod until the empath erupts so they can call them crazy, dramatic, too emotional. But now the empath isn't reacting, they're reclaiming, not their anger, but their energy. Carl Jung wrote that everything unconscious will eventually rise to the surface, and when it does, it arrives as fate. For the empath, this silence is that fate, the beginning of individuation. The sacred process of returning to the self, not the self molded by guilt or neediness, but the self that existed before the world taught them to serve at the expense of their soul. And in this quiet, something miraculous happens. The empath begins to feel themselves again. The inner child, the intuition, the voice that was buried beneath years of compromise. It speaks softly. You don't need to explain your worth. You don't need to prove your love. You are allowed to walk away. To the narcissist, this silence is unbearable, because it reflects something they cannot understand: self-possession. And once the empath touches that, even briefly, the spell breaks. Not with a scream, not with a fight, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that says, I've seen enough, I've felt enough, and now I choose myself. It doesn't scream. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't beg to be believed. But when the empath finally says it, something ancient and unspoken shifts in the room. That's not mine to carry anymore. Just 7 words. But they are a boundary, a release, a mirror held up to every manipulative tactic that came dressed as love. The beauty of this sentence lies in its simplicity. It doesn't explain, it doesn't argue. It doesn't fall into the trap of debating reality with someone who only plays to win. It just returns the energy to its rightful owner. Every projection, every guilt trip, every distorted narrative handed to the empath like an emotional debt, they hand it back, calmly, clearly. That's not mine to carry anymore. To the narcissist, this is psychological mutiny, because their entire strategy hinges on confusion, blurring lines, shifting blame, making the empath responsible for their dysfunction. But this sentence is a sword. It cuts through gaslighting like glass. It invalidates manipulation not with rage, but with refusal. You feel abandoned? That's not mine to carry. You're angry I set a boundary? Not mine. You don't like who I've become without your control? Still none of that is mine. Carl Jung taught that projection is the act of putting what we refuse to face in ourselves onto someone else. The narcissist, unable to face their own shadow, deposits it into the empath, then blames them for feeling the weight. But when the empath utters this sentence, they break the psychic contract. They refuse to be the container. They step out of the role. And the moment they do, the narcissist is left alone with the very parts of themselves they were so desperate to avoid. It's not a fight. It's an awakening, a declaration that the empath is done being the emotional landfill for someone else's unresolved chaos. That sentence isn't closure, it's a key. The moment it's spoken, the door opens. And the empath, for the first time in a long time, walks through it free. Control isn't built on strength. It's built on smoke and mirrors. Confusion is the glue that holds a narcissist's power together. They create chaos, then offer themselves as the only calm. They start the fire, then hand you the extinguisher while blaming you for the flames. And for a long time, the empath believes it. They chase clarity, explanations, peace, not realizing that the confusion is intentional. It's the weapon. But something shifts the moment the empath stops chasing closure and starts claiming truth. The air changes. The power dynamic flips. Because clarity is the one thing the narcissist cannot survive. When an empath speaks from grounded truth without emotion, without defense, without fear, the illusion collapses almost instantly. It's like pulling the curtain back on a stage production that only worked in the dark. The narcissist thrives on ambiguity, on keeping you unsure of what's real, what's yours, and what belongs to them. But when the empath calmly says, "I know who I am," or "that's not mine to hold," or even says nothing at all and just walks away, that's when the unraveling begins. Because there's nothing left to hook into. No emotional reaction to exploit, no confusion to manipulate. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The narcissist is unconscious chaos. The empath, once awakened, becomes fate itself, a force that no longer bends, no longer apologizes, no longer waits to be validated. They see the script, and they exit the play. This loss of control terrifies the narcissist, not because they miss the empath, but because they lost the audience, the mirror, the fuel. They are forced, for the first time, to face the void they've been hiding behind charm and rage. And that's why they react with panic, with smear campaigns, with love bombing and guilt. Because without control, they are nothing, and they know it. But by then, the empath has already shifted. Their energy no longer vibrates in reaction, it radiates in truth. And truth is the one language a narcissist cannot speak, because truth doesn't beg. It doesn't explain. It just is. And once it arrives, the performance ends. Here's the part no one tells you. Empaths don't stop loving. They stop leaking. There's a difference. Detachment isn't the absence of carrots, the presence of boundaries. It's what happens when an empath finally realizes that their endless compassion, without direction, becomes a lifeline for someone who never intended to swimmingly to pull them under. For so long, the empath confuses love with availability. They stay open, accessible, emotionally flexible. They check in, hold space, absorb every shift in tone, every unspoken wound. But over time, that open channel becomes a drain. And instead of connection, what flows is depletion. What started as nurturing becomes sacrifice. And what once felt like love starts to feel like slow erosion. Detachment changes that. It's not a wall, it's a gate. Not a rejection, but a redirection. The empath doesn't become cold, they become precise. They stop responding to every emotional emergency as if it's their responsibility to solve. They stop interpreting silence as something they must fill. They stop taking on moods that were never theirs to begin with. Carl Jung believed that true awareness comes not from emotional flooding, but from conscious integration. And that's what detachment really is: integration. It's the moment the empath stops, confusing intensity with intimacy, drama with connection, guilt with obligation. And the narcissist feels it immediately, because what they feed on isn't just attention, it's access, emotional access. And now, that access is denied, not with anger, but with indifference. Not with hate, but with disinterest. Because the empath has remembered something essential. You can love someone and still walk away. You can care and still say no. You can feel deeply and still choose peace over performance. Detachment doesn't make the empath less emotional, it makes them more discerning. They stop offering their energy as a currency and start treating it like the sacred resource it is. That shift, subtle, quiet, unstoppably, is what ends the cycle. Because without access, there is no control. And without control, the narcissist has nothing left to hold on to but their own unraveling. Something unsettling happens when an empath stops absorbing and starts reflecting. The mirror flips. And for the first time, the narcissist doesn't see admiration or validation, they see themselves. Raw. Distorted. Unmasked. What they gave, they get. What they projected bounces back. And in that reversal, the power dynamic crumbles. Carl Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead to an understanding of ourselves, but narcissists avoid that understanding like the plague. Their entire identity is built on avoiding the shadow, the parts of themselves they cannot accept. So they outsource it. They hand their insecurity to the empath and call it criticism. They deliver their shame and call it your failure. They cast their chaos into your calm and call it your drama. But now, the empath isn't taking it anymore. They've stopped becoming what the narcissist needs them to be. They don't absorb the insult. They don't react to the bait. They simply reflect. And in that reflection, the narcissist sees what they've never been willing to face: the emptiness, the manipulation, the deep hunger that no amount of control could ever satisfy. The mirror doesn't lie, just waits. And when the narcissist finally looks and sees not a compliant partner, but a grounded, silent, immovable truth staring back at them, it shakes their foundation. Because what they once saw as weakness, empathy, sensitivity, softness, was never weakness at all. It was awareness. And now that awareness has become strength. This is the moment the narcissist starts to unravel. Not because the empath fought back, but because they didn't. Because they stopped performing. Stopped proving, stopped participating in the illusion. The mirror reflects, not with malice, but with precision. And it shows the narcissist the one thing they cannot endure: themselves. This reversal isn't revenge, it's evolution. The empath didn't change to hurt the narcissist. They changed to heal themselves. And in doing so, they dismantled the dynamic. Because when a mirror stands firm, the truth it reflects becomes inescapable. And for the narcissist, truth is the one thing that was never part of the script. There comes a momentous, sacred, irreversible shift when the empath simply stops explaining. Not out of spite, not out of defeat, but out of knowing. Deep, bone-level knowing that no amount of words will ever be enough for someone committed to misunderstanding them. And in that moment, the rules of the game collapse. You see, explanation is fuel to the narcissist. Every justification, every clarification, every attempt to be understood, it's not heard with empathy. It's stored as ammunition. They take your truths and twist them into traps. Your honesty becomes evidence. Your vulnerability, a weakness to exploit. So the more you try to make them understand, the deeper you sink into the web they spun for you. But silence, true, grounded silence, sees different. It doesn't fight, it doesn't plead, it just is. And when the empath embraces that silence, everything changes. Because narcissists can't argue with stillness. They can't twist what isn't said. They can't control a boundary that isn't being debated. It's simply being lived. This silence isn't passive. It's an active declaration. I don't owe you an explanation for my peace. I don't need your permission to walk away. I don't need to prove that I'm worthy of respect. I already am. Carl Jung understood this dynamic well. He spoke of individuation as the moment a person separates from the false self imposed by others and steps fully into their own truth. For the empath, silence becomes that threshold, the space where they stop over-functioning in conversations that were never meant to bring healing, only control. And when that silence is paired with a boundary, it becomes impenetrable, not a wall made of anger, but a door that simply closes, quietly, firmly, without drama. Because the empath has finally understood, love doesn't require a constant defense, and the need to explain was never about connection, it was about survival. That need is gone now, and in its place is clarity, peace, and a voice that no longer performs. It simply speaks when it's ready and rests when it's not. If silence is the empath's liberation, it is the narcissist's unraveling. Because control doesn't vanish with confrontation, it crumbles in the absence of reaction. And when the empath stops explaining, stops feeding the cycle, stops participating in the performance, the narcissist spirals, fast. First comes the rage. It's loud, chaotic, sudden. How dare you ignore me? You're ungrateful. You're the problem. This isn't real. Anger, it's panic disguised as power. Because your silence has shattered the script. And without your emotional energy to pull from, the narcissist is exposed. Their identity, built entirely on manipulation and response, has nothing left to lean on. When rage doesn't work, guilt takes its place. The voice softens. Regret appears like smoke. I just miss how we used to be. You've changed. I guess I'm just the villain now. These are not apologies. They are emotional traps dressed in sincerity. But the empath sees it now. Their nervous system, once hijacked by the need to fix, is finally still. There is no hook left to hang this guilt on. And then, the final card, vulnerability. Suddenly the narcissist is broken, wounded, lost. They confess their pain, their childhood, their trauma. It sounds honest. It feels human. But this too is strategy. Not because pain isn't real, but because it's being weaponized. Offered not to connect, but to regain control. It's one last attempt to pull the empath back into the cycle by appealing to the very trait that made them a target, their empathy. But this time, it doesn't work, because the empath isn't reacting from guilt anymore. They're responding from clarity. They can see the pattern without needing to rescue it. They can witness pain without absorbing it. They can care without returning. This meltdown isn't a sign of love. It's the death rattle of control, a last-ditch effort to regain power over someone who finally remembered their worth. And when the empath doesn't flinch, when they stand rooted, silent, unshaken, that's when the narcissist knows it's over. Not because the empath hates them, but because the empath finally loves themselves enough to never go back. Once the empath walks away, there is no applause, no parade, just silence. A still, unfamiliar silence that at first feels like emptiness but is actually the beginning of reclamation. Because when you've spent your life being a home for everyone else's chaos, peace can feel like absence, but it's not. It's presence your own. This is the phase where the empath doesn't become cold. They become whole. And that difference is everything. They are not building walls. They're planting roots. They are not rejecting love. They are redefining it. For the first time, they are no longer asking, "Am I too much?" or "What more can I give?" They are asking, "What nourishes me? What feels safe? What am I no longer willing to sacrifice just to belong?" Carl Jung taught that healing doesn't come from light alone, it comes from facing the shadow, and that's exactly what the empath is now doing. They're no longer exiling their anger, their sadness, their boundaries. They're integrating it all. The part that stayed too long, the part that couldn't say no, the part that mistook tolerance for love. Every fragmented piece is welcomed back not with shame, but with compassion. Because the empath has finally realized that sacrificing yourself for love isn't nobly its erasure. And connection that costs your soul is not connection, it's captivity. So they begin the slow, sacred work of coming home to themselves, of listening to the voice that was always there, whispering beneath the noise, "You are enough, as you are, without earning it." This is not a rebirth, it's a return. And in that return, the empath no longer needs to fix others to feel whole. They no longer confuse suffering with significance. They are enough, not because they give everything, but because they have reclaimed what was always theirs, their inner space, their voice, their light. And from that space, love will one day flow again, not out of need, but out of overflow, not to be seen, but because they see themselves, clearly, finally, fully. There's a fine line between empathy and martyrdom, a line many empaths cross without even realizing it. Because when you've been conditioned to equate love with self-sacrifice, it's easy to believe that losing yourself is proof of your devotion. But here's the truth. Martyrdom is not love, it's submission. And it's not holy, it's hollow. Martyrs give until they vanish. They stay when it hurts. They shrink to keep others comfortable. They carry the weight of everyone else's wounds and call it purpose. But what they're really doing is bleeding quietly, hoping someone will finally notice, finally thank them, finally make it worth it. But the recognition never comes. And even if it did, it wouldn't be enough. Because martyrdom feeds on the belief that your worth comes only from what you endure. Empowered empathy is different. It's not loud, but it's clear. It gives with discernment, not desperation. It loves without losing itself. It knows that boundaries are not cruelty, they are clarity. It says yes with intention and no without guilt, and it never confuses suffering with significance. Carl Jung spoke of sovereignty of the self, the idea that true individuation means standing in your own center, not orbiting around the needs of others. The empowered empath lives there, not in coldness, but in coherence, not in isolation, but in alignment. They don't give everything, they give wisely. And in doing so, they preserve the one thing no one else can give them, their own truth. The difference is this: the martyr waits to be saved. The empath saves themselves. The martyr drowns to keep others afloat. The empath offers a hand, but stays on solid ground. The martyr says, "Love me, even if it breaks me." The empowered empath says, "Love me, but never ask me to abandon myself again." And that shift, from martyr to sovereign empathist, the beginning of everything. It's where healing deepens, where relationships transform, where the cycle ends. Because now, the empath isn't loving to be seen, they're loving from a place of already being whole. And that love, it doesn't burn them out, it builds them up. There is no need to scream when you know your worth. No need to seek revenge. No final speech, no dramatic exit. Just a shift. A calm, grounded, irrevocable shift. Because the moment the empath understands they were never the problem, they no longer need to prove it. Their boundary becomes their revolution, and it's silent but absolute. It doesn't look like war. It looks like peace. The kind that comes when you stop arguing with those who are committed to chaos. When you stop asking the narcissist to meet you in honesty. When you stop needing to be chosen because you already chose yourself. That's the kind of boundary that doesn't require fences or force. It's an energetic wall, invisible, unshakable, and it changes everything. The narcissist can't manipulate someone who no longer needs their approval, because their power was never in who they were, it was in what you believed you lacked. Your self-doubt was their access point. Your over-explaining was their script. Your guilt was their control. But now, the stage is empty. The show is over. You left the theater without a single word, and that silence is deafening. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that's exactly what the empath has done. Fully, without apology. They don't need revenge, because they're too busy reclaiming joy. They don't need to be right, because they've already made peace with the truth, and they don't need closure because they became the closure. This is the quiet revolution of self-worth. It doesn't look like retaliation, it looks like rest. It doesn't need validation, it radiates truth. And the narcissist, for all their theatrics, rage, and reach, can no longer touch what they never built, your wholeness. Because when an empath stops performing, stops explaining, stops bleeding for love, that's not the end of the relationship, that's the beginning of liberation. They only fed off you because you didn't know your value. That's the truth. That's the thread that unravels the entire story. The narcissist didn't love you, they consumed you, your kindness, your attention, your endless efforts to be enough. They weren't connecting with you, they were feeding on the light you hadn't yet claimed as your own. But now, you're no longer food. You're no longer a resource. You're no longer a mirror that only reflects what they want to see, because something irreversible has happened. You woke up, not with rage, not with revenge, but with recognition. You saw the pattern, you named the lie, and then you chose yourself. That's when everything changes, because once an empath reclaims their worth, they become untouchable, not because they're guarded, but because they're aligned. Not because they hate, but because they see. They've stopped waiting to be chosen, because they already know they are enough. And that knowledge it radiates, it protects, it rewrites every dynamic moving forward. Carl Jung taught that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that's exactly what the empath has done. They walked into the shadow, named it, faced it, and walked out with their soul intact. That journey doesn't make them bitter, it makes them sovereign. Now, when the narcissist returns sand, they will, always looking for the door, they'll find it locked. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. The energy is no longer accessible, the hook no longer lands. Because what once drew them in the empath's unclaimed worth is no longer up for consumption, it's been called home. So let them call you cold, let them accuse you of changing. You have. You've changed from someone who gave endlessly to someone who protects their peace like it's sacred because it is. You've changed from someone who asked, "What more can I do?" to someone who says, "This is who I am, take it or leave it." And the moment you say that with no fear, no plea, no performance, that's when you know you are no longer food. You are fire. You are the mirror turned inward. You are the one who finally walked away whole. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.